Martin and Graham, great to have you here. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping, so I apologise if you've heard this before, but just to remind you that this session is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube afterwards. Please remember that if you're participating like you are now, we've obviously got a chat panel on the side that's not recorded. So anything you put on there may be lost later when we finish at the end. So if there's particular things that you want to pass over to us or share information, then I would recommend that you would use the HackPad. And I see, Graham, that you've already started doing that. So that's fabulous. Thank you. So informal session, really, the way it's going to work is basically Martin, yay, Martin Weller, who is the king of OER, is going to do most of the talking. Myself, I'm project manager for the OER Hub team, and OERs are quite new to me, so this is all kind of trying to broaden my horizon of understanding what's included in that big field there. So it's been really interesting, and it's great to kind of meet people through this process as well. So I'll be fielding any, well, I was going to say any questions if there were more people. So Graham, I'm just going to say please get involved as much as you can. Feel free to ask Martin anything you want. Obviously he's going to talk around the issue of ethics in the open, but as this is a little bit more informal and there is just the three of us, it'll be great to have that kind of conversation flowing. So please feel comfortable to do that as you go along. So thank you very much for joining us, and Martin, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Nats. I think Rob Farrow uses this session, but he couldn't do it, and Rob comes to it. Rob's got a philosophy PhD, so he comes to it kind of from a much more deeper level, I think, and a kind of theoretical foundation. So really, although ethics isn't my area of expertise in that sense, so I'm really going to come at it from just thoughts I have about being a kind of practitioner in the open, and also some slight misgivings I've begun to have about being the sort of the advocate for openness. Kind of there's a kind of moral responsibility that comes along with that as well, I think. So before we get into that, I think it's easy when you talk about ethics to kind of end up just sounding very negative, and the conclusion seems to be, for God's sake, don't do anything. Just lock yourself in a bunker and don't do anything. So although we're probably going to touch upon some issues to think about and some areas, some problematic areas, I kind of want to preface all that by saying that I still think operating in the open is a good thing to do. There are great benefits from it. In some ways, it's pretty much essential for an academic to operate this way. So this shouldn't be taken as a kind of no, don't do that. It's more of a kind of a yes, but we have to kind of consider these other things as well now. I think that in itself is interesting. I think I've been a long time kind of advocate for academics developing online profiles through blogs and publishing open access stuff, and I think, and early on in that, it's like in any movement, you kind of slightly ignore the downsides because you don't want to put people off. So you kind of you promote all the good stuff, all the benefits, and sort of perhaps downplay or only quietly mention some of the possible negatives. And also, I think a lot of those things don't become known until there's a kind of critical mass. So I think it represents a kind of a sense of maturity of the open field, if you like, open education resources, open education, that we can look at some of those kind of downsides in more detail, because we're not so scared about frightening people off, I think, because I think the motivations for operating in the open are quite strong now. So I stuck some things in the HackPad to talk about. And jump in at any point, Graham. I see you've put some stuff in there as well. So the first is this thing I've talked about, kind of encouraging researchers to operate in the open. And I think there are great benefits to that, as I've said. I often sort of cite the example of Katie Jordan, my PhD student, who did that work on MOOC completion rates. Just by using open data, blogging about it openly, it got picked up by other blogs and sort of became the kind of de facto piece and for MOOC completion rates. So that's a really good example, I think, of open scholarship. But I think in some ways it's gained so much momentum now that it's almost not a case of isn't a good idea to develop an online identity, but pretty much you have to have one. So we're kind of forcing people to be online now. I often give talks to early career researchers, and I kind of end it by saying, like, you're kind of screwed both ways. I think as an early career researcher, you have to play the traditional game. You're going to still have to publish stuff in journals and traditional articles and that. But also, as an early career researcher, one of the best things you can do is develop a really good online profile. And that's what people will come. That's as important, if not more important, than your online identity. So in some sense, I think it's difficult to be a functional academic, particularly an early career researcher, without developing that online identity now. So we're kind of forcing people to do that. I think so. We do have a responsibility then to highlight the risks that come with that, and those risks can be things like trolling, getting involved, and there are nasty people out there. But also just the sense of giving up data, giving up a sense of your own privacy, and establishing an identity. And I was saying something yesterday, the good thing about social media is it kind of really blurs the boundaries between your kind of personal identity and professional identity. And the bad thing about social media is it really blurs the boundaries. So it becomes difficult to know when to switch off and how much you give of yourself, what's the right sort of level and stuff. And people can learn a lot about you, whether you intend it or not. So I think there's kind of just a general picture there of we've passed a tipping point, I think, where having an online identity was an unusual thing. Even sort of 4 or 5 years ago, having a blog was still quite unusual, and you were regarded as a bit of a freak. And I think now it's regarded as pretty much normal, or at least having something in academia.edu or ResearchGate or a Twitter profile. Those are kind of all regarded as part of things that you do as an academic. So by forcing people onto doing that and highlighting the benefits, then there does a kind of responsibility comes with that. So that's the kind of my reservations about doing it, but I still think it's a good thing to do. I don't know if Graham, you had any thoughts on that aspect?
Yeah, well, I've been taking notes, but yeah, pretty much agree with all that you've said.
Good. We're going to have to find some things to argue about, aren't we, Graham?
So, Graham, sorry, I didn't ask you in the beginning. Can you just give us a little bit about your background and what you're looking for out of this conversation as well?
Sure. Having watched back part of last week, I shall try and speak slower than I did last time. But I only found out about this about half an hour before the first session last week, so I'm still fairly new. But briefly, my background is more sort of the open science related, and patient advocacy. It was what got me started. So my main focus is on scientific publishing, open access, open data, open science, and I'm aware of open research as an entity, but I'm just here to learn more, basically.
Right.
Thanks, Graham. I think it'd be interesting. Perhaps the next bit is to talk about open data, so I'd be interested to get your take on that, because I think that's where we get in some really interesting areas, both about the possibilities it brings to us, and you've put up some links in the HackPad to things about medical data, which I think we can all think about how useful that would be, having all that data kind of pulled together, but it also highlights the kind of tricky ethical issues about how much we release. So I think open data is kind of really interesting, because just from our perspective, I know on the Open Research Hub, we released our survey data openly, and there wasn't a zero cost activity. So for a start, it takes an awful lot of time to anonymize that data to the point where you can release it. I think it's okay if you've got data from crushing rocks, you're okay. You can probably just release it as it is, but getting the data to state, it took a long time. So Bayer did most of the kind of cleaning up to release that, and so there is a cost involved in doing it. I also think the more we encourage people to release open data, we're putting them in a potentially tricky situation. But, you take a PhD student might be encouraged to release the data openly, and I think people often don't appreciate how easy it is to de-anonymize data, and de-anonymizing data is quite a specialist skill. So you might think you've perfectly kind of anonymized your data and can release it openly, but there's lots of kind of research that you only need 3 data points to sort of identify someone 85% of the time, kind of accuracy. So, so I think we could be pushing people to do things that they don't realise are quite sensitive and dangerous. If you're releasing interviews with people and things like that that are on potentially sensitive subjects, or even not that sensitive, it could be opening up all sorts of things. I was at Alt-C last week, or the week before, and Jonathan Worth was saying that at his daughter's school, they're forced to use the school email, and the school email, I think he was saying something like it's the child's full name, including middle name, and then the year they're in, the school. So that gives away their age, their full name, what school they go to, just by using an email address. If they use that externally, that probably from those bits of data you could identify where that child lives and stuff. So the school is kind of really forcing students to kind of reveal a lot of data and giving them no choice in this. There's a real kind of duty of care, I think, there. So there's that side, I think, about releasing open data. And then I think there's the whole picture about, what we do with analytics and big data. But perhaps I'll give back to you, Graham. You probably have a better understanding around these kind of big data sets from medical trials and things.
Yeah, I was just trying to find a quote, but I'll get that posted probably later on. I can't find it at my fingertips. But yeah, so yeah, I became involved in patient advocacy in 2001, and yeah, so I was dealing with the patients' families, that sort of stuff, and was obviously aware about sensitive data, etc. And yeah, so you had to learn what you could and couldn't do. But this was just at the sort of cusp of having access to the internet, and yeah, I agree that the issue of de-identifying it can be quite a difficult and tricky expertise area, not one that I've ever had to get involved in, apart from just using common sense. But yeah, the web, there's a lot of good, bad, and indifferent information on the web, and yeah, certain patients are quite happy to use platforms like patients like me to openly share their data. So that's quite a very radical approach that would have been extremely hard to do without the web. But generally it's a very tricky issue. There's pros and cons about all sides of the argument, but I think to a certain extent, generally speaking, the genie is out of the bottle.
So from your experience, what are people willing to share certain types of data once it's explained to them, or is there a kind of a blanket fear about data sharing from patients?
I think things have evolved. I think probably originally there would be a blanket issue about sharing information, but if you go down to the hackpads, there's a very good quote from John Milbanks that I posted just below the photograph, but the very last sentence summarises it for me. But for those watching, there's a quote from John Milbanks from when he was in Edinburgh 2012, basically saying that not using data to understand health issues through mathematical analysis is like having a giant set of power tools but leaving them not plugged in when whilst they're using hand saws.
Yes. I think, and perhaps to try and end on a positive note when we come back to it, I'd like to come back to it, because I think we talk about the ethics of being open, but there's a very big counter, but there's an ethical side about not being open as well, so perhaps we can sort of come back to that at the end. The other kind of area about open data is, I think there's often an assumption just because something's up online then you can do what you want with it, but I think there's a layer of interpretation you can sometimes bring to data that people can't anticipate, so that brings in an ethical dimension. So I did a blog post about the puppy killer scenario. That I was sort of trying to have an absurd example so people didn't sort of get hung up on the detail. But so people like Tony Hurst, my colleague, is very good at kind of working through different open data sets, and you think that there could be kind of ethical implications for doing that. So in my example was, say there are people who go around killing puppies, something we all think's not a nice thing to do.
Yeah.
And someone does a trawl through and finds that actually the people who are puppy killers tend to have similar Facebook profiles, that they like similar things on Facebook or similar Twitter activities. So there's some data they pull together from open data.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And then someone else goes through and finds other people who are not convicted puppy killers and says, look, they've got similar Twitter profiles or Facebook profiles. So then you've done something different with the data, kind of, in my ridiculous example, to kind of put a group of people potentially at risk, So I think it's just, as an example, trying to highlight that even though our base assumption is if stuff's up online, it's kind of fair game, but through data manipulation, you can do different things with it, and you can end up in quite tricky ethical areas. And I think we see this a bit in MOOC research as well. So MOOCs are generally open, the forums are open, and so they've attracted a lot of interest from people who come along and do open research. And you're not as tied to some of the ethical considerations that you are elsewhere, because you're not dealing with kind of real live students who are paying money, that kind of thing. So does that make it fair game to kind of more or less do what you want with that data? And I think there are issues around that. I'm not entirely, and I think some people have been unhappy with some of that, the MOOC stuff that's come out. They've kind of felt it's misrepresented their course or their experience on a course, and people can come to it with an agenda and want to do certain things, or you may not realise when you're putting a piece up on a forum that someone might be using it for research purposes and those kind of things. So it does raise other issues, I think, and that gets onto I have this thing that I like to call guerrilla research, which again I think of it as a good thing. So it's research you don't need permission to do. So you can just go and do it using open data or online stuff, and actually it's quite an exciting possibility that everyone being online opens up, because to do this type of research before would have required really large research projects. So the example I like to give is travel blogs. So often when people do this traveling around the world kind of thing, or gap year stuff, they keep travel blogs about where they go, their experiences, that kind of stuff. And these have become a really rich source of research data for people. So people have written about notions of identity that people develop through these blogs that the travellers have, and they never call themselves tourists. That's a kind of strong part of the identity. People look at them as marketing tools, all that kind of stuff. So it's really, so in order to do that beforehand, you would have had to set up a massive research project to get these people to keep diaries for you that they send back to you. And now you've just got all that rich data just available, so it's great. But I think there is also a sense of an ethical issue around that as well, because some of these blogs are then being quoted in the research, and I don't think they asked people's permission to do so. It was that it's online, it's open, therefore it's fair game. And as I mentioned, they were saying things like, that these people are very strongly don't like to call themselves tourists and disassociate themselves from the whole idea of tourism and think themselves better than that in a way. So there was almost like a kind of a judgment being passed on those people for how they construe their identity. And I think previously you would have had to acquire permission to do that kind of work. So I'm not sure I've got a conclusion there, but I think it's a good example of how you can get into areas that have ethical considerations, and just because something's online doesn't mean that it's it's all fair game, or you don't have to think about ethics. Oh, have we lost Graham?
Sorry, yes, it's just his connection's gone.
I was just rambling on then. Random.
Okay, it makes sense.
Okay, well, I'll wait a minute, see if Graham comes back. If not, we'll wrap up. Graham's added something else in about the internet, open data, and semantic web in the hackpad that looks good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to end then if we don't get Graham back, because otherwise it's just me talking to myself. And say, I think the point I made to Graham Rando is that it's easy to talk about issues that being open brings ethical issues, but it's also, we should consider there's an ethical side to not being open. So hiding your data, keeping it private, means that other people can't benefit from it. That particularly applies, I think, with medical research. So there's a direct impact from hiding that stuff away. So not being open has an ethical dimension that you need to consider. And so we shouldn't always. And I think our default assumption is that things are closed, and then you make an argument for them to be open. And I think you could make an argument that the default should be open, and only then, if there are considerations, that you should think about why you might not make stuff open. And the same applies with that there's a very strong ethical consideration for open access publishing. You're back, Graham. Sorry,
yes.
I was just wrapping up. I thought I was just making that comment about the ethical considerations about not being open, and I think that that plays very strongly in the medical field. So by not making your data publicly available, there's you're disadvantaging others. And I know you're a big open access advocate as well, Graham. And I think there's that issue around by not making your research open access. So my argument was that the default should be open, and I think we often work on the assumption that the default is closed, and you make an argument to go open and then consider the ethical considerations, whereas we should flip that and think the default is open and then make arguments about why you might not want to do that. But I don't know if you had any thoughts on the ethical considerations of being closed.
Yeah. Did I get to cut off midway through what I was saying, or did you catch what I said before I got cut off?
I didn't catch it. We didn't catch what you said. No.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was the quote I was looking for earlier. This came from Sir Paul Nurse, President of the Royal Society, in around about 2013, who said, Sir Paul said, in reality, no data was totally secure, and that the doctors already relied on personal information for treatment. If you want a complete guarantee of privacy, you would have to diagnose and treat yourself.
That's true, yes. Yeah.
But the ethics of not sharing information, I guess it depends on the circumstances, depends on the patient. Some patients will want full access to their medical records, for example. It wouldn't be a wise move for people to obviously share their medical history online, but no doubt some people would do it, but certainly it wouldn't be wise to do that.
Yeah.
For various reasons.
That's right, and I think that's the other thing, we do have a responsibility to educate people about the implications of these things, because I think people do share quite openly without realising what those implications might be. So I think there was a piece in The Guardian about, I think someone was refused a mortgage recently because of sort of data that they'd managed to gather from elsewhere that this person was completely kind of unaware of. So I think so what might happen to your data and what the implications are, I think are something we need to kind of educate people about. Now that's very difficult, I think, actually, to kind of see these sort of down the line what these implications might be. Okay. Do you have any other bits to add? Or otherwise, I think we can wrap up there.
What else did I got in the pad? Yeah, just to briefly touch upon Ben Goldacre's forthcoming initiative, which he follows on from his all trials work, but this is open trials. There's a link to that on the pad. That was announced with the Open Knowledge Foundation back in April. I last met Ben about 3 months ago, and he gave us a very short talk about what he was about to do. I was quite openly filming him doing the whole thing, and then at the end of it he said, this is unpublished, so don't share it. But that's the website is live, but there's not much information on it. It's probably just opentrials.org, I think. I need to click on that link. My main PC is down, but that's an initiative which sort of combines what he's doing with the all trials, but just to make sure that in terms of open data, in terms of trials, is to get as much information out there as possible. It's quite a sort of radical. But I think it's one that will be interesting to watch.
So I think the whole kind of medical pharmaceutical industry, you can see that that's kind of ripe for openness to kind of strike. It's expensive, and so what we're beginning to see with textbooks in the US particularly is that instead of paying to purchase things, states and things, particularly driven by people like David Wiley and Cable Green, that trying to get people to states to pay to create things which they then own the license to. I don't know whether the finances would quite work out in medicine, but you can imagine you might make that switch. Instead of the NHS buying drugs that it spends a lot of money on, instead it pays to develop the drugs, but then the drugs are openly licensed and free for people to, or people can produce them cheaply rather than having to buy licensed material. So openness kind of can flip the kind of economics of these processes, and again that gets back to the kind of, I think Ben's stuff is very good about the whole kind of, it's a very big ethical issue about, we hide all this data from trials and only release it, well, companies hide it and just release it selectively when they need to, and everyone's just repeating the same trials over and over again without sharing it, and it's just that just seems but ethically wrong, and also just madness. Yeah. Good. Well, thanks for raising that, Graham. Good. Should we wrap up there then?
Unless Graham's got any other questions or thoughts that he wanted to raise. Anything, any challenges fundamentally that you think hasn't been addressed, or that you would like to implement yourself?
Ooh. If I was in charge, no, I think just generally wherever possible to make as much information open, transparent. Obviously in certain circumstances, if it's sensitive data, then you have to be careful. But I think it's a scandal with regards to clinical trials that I can't remember the precise figure, but roughly half of the information that's gathered is not shared. That's just wrong.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, what's his name? Ian Chalmers from Cochrane. I mean, he's been banging on about this since about 1970. But we can make there's a lot more we can do.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay. Good.
Right. I need to get my main internet connection sorted out. I'm just using my back. I've got another incoming call in half an hour, so I better get things.
Well, thanks for rescuing it again, Graham.
And we'll just do next week.
Yeah, cheers.
We look forward to seeing you, Graham. Please keep in touch. And then it's just to anything else you want to sort of add or comment on, please use our Twitter with the hashtag Open Research. And then we look forward to seeing you in the following weeks as well.
And you guys.
So thank you very much for contributing. Thank you, Martin, for leading.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.